Hi, this is Kristen, and I'm going to cover the OER online textbook section 4.2, which discusses epithelial tissue. I'm going to focus on big picture points like just being able to describe the basic structure and function of epithelial tissue throughout the body. Being able to You should be able to identify the three main types of cell junctions that connect the lateral sides of cells within epithelial tissue, and then also be able to distinguish between simple epithelia and stratified epithelia. And then also we'll talk a little bit about glands, and we'll focus on exocrine glands, but you should know the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands. So first we'll just talk about the general structure of epithelium. There are two types of epithelium. There's covering and lining epithelium, and these are basically large sheets of cells that cover the body surfaces exposed to external environment outside your body, or they can be large sheets of cells that cover body surfaces lining internal cavities. The second type of epithelium would be glandular epithelium, and this includes epithelial cells that form glandular tissue. And so glands basically produce a product and then secrete it. So we're going to talk about covering and lining epithelium, and then we'll also talk about glandular epithelium. It's also important to mention the embryonic origin of epithelial tissue. You'll recall we've discussed the three primary germ layers that arise during the embryonic period of human development. The ectoderm leads to cutaneous tissue. The endoderm becomes most mucous membranes. Most mucous membranes are derived from endoderm. And then the epithelium that lines vessels and open spaces within the body, all of that derives from mesoderm. So there are two specific types of epithelium that I want to mention. One of them is endothelium. Endothelium is epithelium that lines lymphatic vessels and the cardiovascular system, including the inside chambers of the heart as well as the blood vessels. That's all made up of endothelium. Mesothelium is epithelium that forms those double-layered serous membranes. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the typical structure of epithelium. So basically, we're looking at an example of, it pretty much looks like simple columnar epithelium. And the reason I say that is because there's one layer of cells here, one layer of epithelial cells. The dark purple is the nucleus. It's a columnar shaped cell, and it's one layer, so we would call it simple columnar. There are two sides to a an epithelial layer. There is an apical layer and a basal layer. And the basal layer, the basal surface of the cell is deeper, and the apical surface is free. In other words, it would be the surface of the cell that's exposed to an open space. The space could be outside the body, or it could be within the body like a cavity. And then below the epithelium is basically sitting on top of a basement membrane. And the basement membrane is comprised of two basic parts. And that includes the basal lamina and the reticular lamina. So So far, some of the key structural features of epithelium are that it pretty much has little to no extracellular material. So you'll notice there's not a lot of space outside these epithelial cells. It's highly cellular and it has virtually no extracellular material between the cells. And you can see there's very little space between the cells. It also has specialized cell junctions. And the cell junction is the part of the cell that is adjacent to the cell sitting beside it. So this line that I'm drawing makes up the cell junction. These lines are the cell junctions. And there are three major types of cell junctions between epithelial cells that we'll talk about in a moment. And then another key feature about epithelial tissue is a feature called polarity. Polarity is when an epithelial cell has an apical surface and a basal surface. And I just got done talking about that. That's called polarity, meaning there's a difference in the structure of the cells at these two surfaces. So polarity refers to the apical and the basal surfaces. And then avascular, epithelial tissue is avascular, which means it's without blood vessels. So instead of having its own blood vessels, nutrients and oxygen enter epithelial tissue by diffusion from underlying tissues, which would be connective tissue. Another key feature about epithelial tissue is that it can rapidly replace its own cells. So those are the key structural features. Now, the basement membrane, as I was mentioning, the basement membrane is the layer between the epithelium and the underlying connective tissue. All epithelial tissue has connective tissue underneath it. That's true of all epithelial tissue. So the basement membrane contains collagen protein fibers, laminin and fibronectin adhesive, glycoproteins, which is basically a sugar protein. Glyco is sugar, protein is protein. It's got large protein carbohydrate complexes called heparan sulfate. It anchors the epithelium to the connective tissue below it. That's the main purpose of the basement membrane. It has a basal lamina and a reticular lamina. Now, the basal lamina, which is shown in kind of the purple, notice it's the same color as the epithelial cells above it. The basal lamina is secreted by epithelial cells. So technically it belongs to the epithelium because it's made by epithelial cells. On the other hand, the reticular lamina, which is shown in kind of a brown right here, that belongs to connective tissue because it is secreted by cells of the connective tissue. And specifically, it is secreted and made by fibroblasts. Any suffix that ends in blast implies that it's a cell that builds or produces new substances. Like osteoblasts make new bone, fibroblasts make new connective tissue. So fibroblasts are connective tissue cells that make new connective tissue by secreting collagen and other fibers. Below the basement membrane, then you come across connective tissue. And this is where you find the blood vessels. This has nerves and blood vessels, and so any Oxygen and nutrients within the blood vessels of this connective tissue will diffuse up into the epithelium. And then, of course, waste, such as carbon dioxide, will diffuse out and into the blood of the connective tissue. Okay, so what's the basic function of epithelial tissue? Well, the basic function is that it serves as the first line of defense. Physical defense, chemical defense, biological defense, all of the above. A second major function is secretion. Many epithelial cells secrete mucus or chemicals onto the apical surface. For example, the small intestine epithelium secretes digestive enzymes that help break down your food into smaller chemicals. Another example would be the respiratory epithelium, which is really considered to be mesothelium. The respiratory mesothelium secretes mucus that traps inhaled particles and microorganisms. Another major function of epithelial tissue is that it covers body surfaces and lines body cavities. And then finally, it makes up glands, glandular epithelium. So what are some of the specialized structures of the epithelial cell? Well, some epithelial cells have cilia, and cilia are little hair-like structures that extend from the apical surface of the cell, and they're supported by microtubules. And the primary purpose of cilia is that they beat and wave in unison, and their function is to move fluids and particles along the surface of the cells. And so one example might be, well, during the second term of this course, we'll discuss the nervous system, and there are ependymal cells in the nervous system, actually within the fluid-filled spaces of the brain, that help circulate cerebrospinal fluid. Another example of cilia would be the cilia of the respiratory tract. They move mucus and dust and pathogens up and out of the respiratory tract. In fact, it moves it up toward your mouth so that you swallow it and swallow any particulate that would have ended up in your lungs. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the different types of cell junctions. Okay, so there are three basic types of cell junctions. And so these are the connections between the sides of cells. And the three major types are tight junctions, gap junctions, and anchoring junctions. And there are basically three types of anchoring junctions. So let's take a look at this picture here. And the first one that we'll discuss is the gap junction. The gap junction is one that allows communication to travel between cells. It allows substances to travel between cells, and substances, when they move between cells, that's how cells communicate with one another. So looking at the gap junction, you'll notice there are these little connexons, these little green tubes, and they form an intercellular passageway between the lateral walls of the adjacent cells, so small molecules like ions can travel between cells. And an ion is just a little charged particle. For example, calcium ion has a positive charge, and chloride ion has a negative charge. And the connexons, this little pathway between the cells, basically is formed by this ring-like connexon. And the connexon, or this communicating junction, consists of these 6 transmembrane proteins that are arranged like segments of an orange. surrounding a water-filled pore. So ions, glucose, amino acids, and other solutes can pass from one cell to the next. And that's basically what happens here. It just moves back and forth. Okay, the second major type of cell junction is a tight junction. Okay, so we did the gap junction. The next one is the tight junction. The tight junction is made up of transmembrane or integral proteins. So that would be a protein that is within the plasma membrane. And it restricts the movement of fluids between cells by fusing together to form this really tight seal. And the adjacent cells are bound together by fusion of the outer phospholipid layer of their plasma membranes. So what this does is it basically creates this, I think of it as like a watertight seal between cells. And I think of it that way because it says tight, it's called the tight junction, so I think watertight. It just helps me remember it. So it seals off the intercellular space. It makes it impossible for solvents and solutes to pass between the cells. And in epithelia, it forms a zone that completely encircles each cell near its apical pole. So some of the examples of a tight junction, they would be in the stomach and the intestines and the urinary bladder. So think about that. You have stomach acid, which is extremely acidic. It has a low pH of around 2. And so in order to prevent that acid from reaching other tissue and potentially damaging it, we have these tight junctions to prevent it from moving through tissues. And then finally, the last major type of tight junction, or excuse me, cell-to-cell junction, would be an anchoring junction. And these are really strong, flexible connections between cells, and their primary function is to prevent tissue from being pulled apart when it's under stress. So I think of an anchoring junction as kind of like two cells held together by really strong Velcro, and if you try to pull them apart, you can't. And there are three basic types of anchoring junctions. There's the desmosome, the adherent junction, and the hemidesmosome. But they all accomplish the same thing. They all prevent cells from being basically torn apart. So for example, they're associated with any cell that might be stretched or put under a lot of pressure. Even the heart has specialized junctions that include anchoring junctions that keep the heart cells from being pulled apart. Okay. So, let's talk a little bit about the cells of epithelial tissue. Simple epithelial tissue is organized as a single layer of cells, and stratified epithelial tissue is formed by several layers. So, notice that these simple cells all have one layer, and then they're named according to their shape as well as the number of layers. So the squamous ones are kind of squatty and flat, like tile. Cuboidal are cube-shaped, and columnar are column-shaped. And this particular simple columnar epithelium has little cilia, which help move fluid by its surface. Okay, if we look at the stratified, cells, we'll notice that there are multiple layers, and they also have the same shapes. So we can have the stratified squamous, the stratified cuboidal, and the stratified columnar. So simple epithelium contains one layer of cells. It's named by the shape of the cells, and all cells touch the basement membrane. But when you're looking at the stratified epithelium, It contains more than one layer, and this is important. It's named according to the shape of its apical layer. So for example, if you look at this example of stratified squamous, the apical layer is pretty squamous shaped, more so than the basal layer. So that's how it gets its name. In stratified epithelium, some cells rest on top of others and do not necessarily touch the basement membrane. Okay, so there are basically four types of simple epithelium. And the three of them are named for their cell shapes. And that would be simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. And then we have a fourth type. The fourth type is pseudo stratified columnar. And this is unique because not all cells reach the free surface. It looks stratified, but it's really simple. It only has one layer, and the shorter cells are covered over by taller ones. Every cell reaches the basement membrane. So let's take a look at this here. If we look at the example of the pseudo-stratified, well, actually I don't really care for that example too much. It doesn't necessarily show everything I just said, but that is an example of the pseudo-stratified, which is sometimes, in this case, it's shown as ciliated. Okay. All right, so another key point about epithelial tissue is that sometimes epithelial tissue has what is called a goblet cell. A goblet cell is a unicellular gland. So it's a single gland that produces and secretes a substance. And the types of epithelial tissue that have goblet cells are simple columnar and pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. And the goblet cells are mucus-secreting cells, so they basically secrete mucus. So, we're going to go ahead and take a look at some goblet cells. Okay, so mucous membranes line body cavities that open to the outside environment. And in this image, you can see a mucous membrane that's taken from the intestines. Here you can see a goblet cell. And that would then secrete mucus onto the apical surface of the epithelial tissue. Below this purple basement membrane shown here that I'm drawing in black, there is the lamina propria. Lamina propria is just a layer of this areolar connective tissue, which is basically a loose connective tissue, so there's a lot of space within it. It's not dense. Okay. Here's another picture showing a goblet cell. Here we're looking at an example of tissue taken from the small intestine, and you can see that we have simple columnar epithelium. The nucleus is where I drew the N. It's ciliated, and between these columnar epithelial cells there are some goblet cells which basically secrete mucin onto the apical surface of the cell, and the mucin mixes with water to form mucus. So we end up with mucus on the apical layer. And then this is the basement membrane here. Okay. And then this would be the lamina propria, or that areolar loose connective tissue. Remember, connective tissue is always underneath or deep to epithelial tissue. Okay, so that's the goblet cell that we often see in epithelial tissue. So now I wanted to go through and just kind of briefly talk about each of the major types of epithelial tissue, and we'll start with the squamous ones. So here we have, we'll start with the simple ones. This is a simple squamous, which means it's got one layer. It's a flat cell, like is shown here. And this is the thinnest type of epithelial tissue in the body because it's a flat cell, it's a thin shaped cell, and it's also a single layer. The simple squamous permits rapid diffusion or transport of substances through its tissue. It also secretes serous fluid. Some examples of this would be the alveoli, or the tiny microscopic air sacs of the lungs. That's alveoli. Also, the little tiny filters in the kidney that produce urine, called glomeruli. A single one is glomerulus. We have simple squamous endothelium and simple squamous serosa. Right now, in this image, we're looking at the simple squamous of the air sacs of the lungs, called the alveoli. So this would be where the air is, here, and these are, this is the simple squamous epithelium. The little purple dots are nuclei. Okay, moving on to the next type. Let's look at simple cuboidal. Simple cuboidal tissue is a single layer of square cells, and sometimes they look kind of round. They can be round cells, and in this picture they look pretty round. They look rounder than they do square. So here is an example. And this is something that would be, because it's a single layer and thin, it would be particularly efficient at absorbing substances or secreting substances. Basically having substances pass through that single layer. They produce mucus, and examples could be found in the liver, the thyroid gland, the mammary gland, the salivary glands of the mouth that produce saliva, the bronchioles, which are the tiny air tubes leading to the microscopic air sacs of the lungs, and also the kidney tubules, the part of the kidney that produces urine. And right now we're looking at a picture of cells that have supposedly been taken from the kidney. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and look at the next type, simple columnar. Simple columnar, again, this is a single layer of tall, narrow cells. And you'll notice that they have they have oval nuclei that are in the basal half of the cell, meaning that the nuclei are closer to the basal surface. They have, often they're ciliated, and so the apical surface of the cell will have little cilia designed to move substances by the surface of the cell. You will find this in the brush border of the microvilli of the small intestine. Sometimes you'll see goblet cells, as you see here, those kind of wine glass shaped cells that secrete mucus, the single celled mucus secreting glands. And here's another, well, in this particular picture of the simple columnar, we're seeing this from the small intestine. So basically, we're looking at the brush border. This layer of cells is very good at absorbing nutrients from food that's been broken down. And that's what we'd expect coming from an epithelial tissue of a single layer. Remember, they're good at secreting and absorbing. And that's what this does. Anything that's thin is going to be good at moving substances through it. Okay, let's look at the pseudo stratified columnar. Okay, so now we're moving to something that's parading, or it's pretending it's got many layers, but really it's just got one single layer. It looks multi-layered, but it's really not. Some of these cells are not reaching the free apical surface. So for example, in this picture, you'll notice that this one right here, this cell, is not reaching the apical surface where the cilia are. Here's the nucleus. But then there's another cell that's kind of over here. And so all of the cells will touch the basal surface, but not all reach the apical surface. There are nuclei at several different levels or heights. Also, the cells often are ciliated, which move substances by the surface, and they're also goblet cells, those wine-shaped single-celled glands. Examples would be found in the respiratory tract and in parts of the male urethra, which would be in the penis. Okay, moving on, we're going to look at stratified epithelia. Okay, so there are two basic types of stratified epithelium. There are keratinized and non-keratinized. So stratified epithelia are going to have many layers. So instead of being good at allowing substances to pass through them, like secretion and absorption, they're going to be particularly good at resisting abrasion because they have so many layers. They're going to be good at protecting. So the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, this is the skin. This would be the epidermis. Keratin is a tough protein within the skin that makes it tough and water resistant, and this is also very abrasion resistant because of its tough protein and the fact that it's many layers. A second type of stratified squamous epithelia would be non-keratinized, which this would be the type that's not on the surface of the skin. This doesn't have that outer surface layer of dead cells. This could be found in the vagina, for example, which has to be good at resisting abrasion. So as I move downward here, we can look at this next picture. Typically, stratified epithelia, whether it be keratinized or non-keratinized, ranges from 2 to 20 or more layers of cells. The cells rest directly on top of other cells. The deepest layer attaches to the basement membrane. And there are basically 3 stratified epithelia that are named for the shapes of their cells. We're presently looking at the squamous one, which is the flat cell, but later we'll look at stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, although stratified columnar is really rare. The fourth type of stratified epithelium is transitional epithelium, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Stratified epithelium is the most widespread epithelium in the body. The deepest layers undergo continuous mitosis, which is basically cell division. And their daughter cells push toward the apical surface and become flatter as they migrate upward. And then finally, if at least it's in the epidermis of the skin, they're going to die and flake off. And that's called exfoliation. Okay, the keratinized stratified squamous epithelia is the one that's making up the cutaneous membrane. It's really good at slowing the loss of water through the skin, really good at resisting abrasion in the skin. It resists penetration by disease-causing organisms or pathogens. It makes up the epidermis. Specifically, we have really thick epidermis in our palms of our hands and our soles of our feet, and that's really heavily keratinized. And the non-keratinized, as I was mentioning, it doesn't have that apical surface of dead cells, but some other examples besides the vagina where you'd find this non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelia would be in the tongue, the oral mucosa, so basically the mouth, the esophagus, which is the tube through which you swallow food. Let's take a look at the picture here. So notice in this particular example that we're looking at non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. This could be in the esophagus or the vagina. Notice that the basement membrane is shown in blue here. Below that is connective tissue. And notice that the cells, the basal layer of cells, looks kind of cuboidal shaped, but yet we classify this as stratified squamous because the cells at the apical layer are very flat and squamous shaped. Okay, so here's an example of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and it's coming from the bottom of the foot or the sole of the foot. So this area here, these are dead squamous cells that are continuously being shed and they flake off. They actually make up most of the dust in your house. And then here we have the epithelial cells that are living, that are shown in this dark purple. And this is all part of the epidermis, everything from here this way. Now, this area here, these are called Dermal Papilla, and this is made up of a loose areolar connective tissue. And then this is the papillary region of the dermis. It's made up of dense irregular tissue. But all of this light-colored area here that I'm going to color in pink, all of this is basically the dermis, the deeper layer of the skin. And the epidermis would be all the dark purple, light purple, and the outer portion. So the epidermis would be from here to here. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay, there's another stratified type. It's stratified cuboidal. And stratified cuboidal is made up of 2 or more cell layers. The surface cells are going to be square or round. They secrete sweat. So they would be in the eccrine sweat glands of the skin. You would find them in the testes, where they're responsible for producing sperm. And they also produce ovarian hormones. They're in tissue that produce ovarian hormones. So some examples would be the sweat gland ducts, the ovarian follicles, and the seminiferous tubules of the testes. So in this particular example, we are looking at a sweat gland duct. So here, this whole thing is coming from the sweat gland duct, and you'll notice that these are the little cuboidal cells here. And this area right here that I'm scribbling in, this would be the lumen of that sweat gland duct. Okay, so we're not even going to look at a picture of the stratified columnar epithelium because it's so rare. So you want to remember that you don't need to know about that one because there are too many examples in the body. Okay, now we'll look at transitional epithelium. Now, transitional epithelium is a multi-layered epithelium. The surface cells change from round to flat when they're stretched. So this reminds me of like an elastic waistband on some pants, the kind you'd want to wear at Thanksgiving when you're eating a lot. And what's great about the transitional epithelium is it allows for tissue to be stretched, such as filling of the urinary bladder. And this can be found in the ureter and in the bladder. And so because the surface cells start off round when the tissue is not stretched, the fact that when the bladder fills up, they then become flat, allows it to be stretched without tearing any of the tissue. And we're seeing this particular example coming out of the kidney, because you can see the picture there of the kidney. Okay, so here's a summary of epithelial tissues. And I've talked about all this, but I strongly encourage you to study this. One thing you'll notice when you look at this, I'm going to go ahead and turn my iPad